Recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to this legislation that would ignore the poisonous environmental impacts of mountaintop removal mining and would attempt to force states to adopt a discredited and vacated midnight Bush administration rule. The mountaintop removal mining is a serious environmental health threat in Appalachia. Companies literally blast the tops off of mountains, scoop out the coal, and dump what is left over, what used to be the mountaintop and the mining residue, into the valley below. In the process, landscapes are scarred, wild habitat is destroyed, mountain streams are buried, fish are killed, and the long-suffering people living in the valleys suffer. They're left with degraded water. It's not simply my opinion or the warnings of a few fringe environmental groups. This is what the science tells us. In a paper published in the journal Science a few years ago, a preeminent scientific journal, dozens of scientists laid this out very clearly, building on a wealth of recent scientific data from a variety of researchers. They wrote that mountaintop mining in valleys fills, in their words, in the valley fills, in their words, revealed serious environmental impacts that mitigation practices cannot successfully address, end quote. Now, the chairman today is talking about detailed procedural matters. Well, he's wrong on that, but the real point is the health of the people in the valleys. These scientists describe that when streams are buried, water emerges from the base of the valley fills containing a variety of solutes that are toxic and damaging to biota. And that, quote, recovery of biodiversity in mining waste impacted streams has not been documented, end quote. In other words, the recovery that they talk about does not exist in fact. It has not been shown to be possible. Most frighteningly for the people who live with these impacts in their backyards, the scientists write, quote, adult hospitalizations for chronic pulmonary disorders and hypertension are elevated as a function of county-level coal production. They know it comes from this. And to continuing the quote, as are the rates of mortality, lung cancer, chronic heart, lung, and kidney disease, end quote. Hospitalizations, hypertension, lung cancer, heart disease, kidney disease, increased flooding. Water with dangerous concentrations of toxic metals, yes, that's what the science says, and the destruction of forests and streams. These are the impacts of mountaintop removal mining that Congress should be addressing today. This is what we should be holding hearings on and writing legislation about. We should be making the protection of people and the environment of the Appalachian region our top priority, and making companies, the mining companies, act responsibly, not just cheaply. But the Republicans, Mr. Chairman, don't seem to want to talk about any of these impacts. They prefer to keep their head in the sand and the gravel and the toxic waste when it comes to this issue. Instead of the real impacts of mountaintop removal mining, they're focusing on imagined impacts of a rule that hasn't even been released yet. They imagine a war on coal. They imagine a political conspiracy to subvert the rule that the Bush administration put in place in the last minutes of their administration, instead of seeking to guarantee clean water for all Americans. So they spend years trying to uncover that conspiracy, all the while forcing the Department of the Interior to spend tens of thousands of hours of staff time and millions of taxpayer dollars in order to comply with their demands and now their subpoenas. and they've come up empty. The Inspector General for the Department of the Interior confirmed in December there were no political shenanigans. There was no misconduct. There was a poor choice of contractors, yes, and a debate among career staff about the proper way to move forward. Could it have been handled better? Maybe. But there was no misconduct. Meanwhile, the rule put in place by the Bush administration, the very rule that this bill would force states to adopt, was thrown out by a federal court 2 weeks ago because the real misconduct was from the Bush administration, which decided that it didn't even need to consider the effects that destroying streams and rivers would have on threatened and endangered species. They did not do the consultation that's required under the law. So this bill would overturn the court's decision, forcibly enact a rule that was improperly developed in the first place, and forbid the Obama administration from actually doing something to protect the streams from being buried and to protect the people who live there. This bill would forbid them from actually doing something to protect forests, fish, wildlife, and humans. Forbid them from actually doing something to protect the health of the people in these communities. And this bill would create its own reality through an amendment added at the last minute that would deem the 2008 rule to have met the requirements of the Endangered Species Act that the court said they did not meet. Now, deem is a word that's not in common use, and it's certainly a strange word the way it's used here in Congress. By deem, they mean they would declare in legislation that the Endangered Species Act was observed and the consultation had taken place, even though it wasn't and it hadn't. It's preposterous. I wish we could do the same thing to environmental destruction caused by mountaintop removal mining, to the contaminated water, and to the health impacts. Simply say, by legislation, that contamination never happened. Those people were never affected. Their health never deteriorated. They didn't die. But we can't do that. This bill does nothing to protect people from the destructive impacts of mountaintop removal mining. It is strongly opposed by a coalition of environmental groups, the Southern Environmental Law Center, the Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, the National Parks Conservation Association, and many more. It is not just I standing here talking about it. It is not even just these scientists. It is many more. Once again, I want everyone to understand that the real issue here today is not bureaucratic procedure. It's not even when a rule might have been issued and what went into making up that rule. But what is at stake today is the safe water for people, the health of the population, and an environment that can save us all. I urge my colleagues to defeat this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.